The trajectory of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century was not a slow decline, but a violent, ideological whiplash. The transition from the oppressive monarchy of Sultan Abdul Hamid II to the nationalistic dictatorship of the three Pashas represents one of the most consequential pivots in modern history. Understanding this shift requires looking past the eventual tragedy of 1915 and focusing on the internal mechanics of a revolution that promised liberty but delivered a xenophobic autocracy. In 1908, the Ottoman Empire was a pressure cooker of ethnic and political tension. The Young Turk Revolution emerged as a direct challenge to the Hamidian regime period defined by paranoia, censorship, and the brutal Hamidian massacres. The Committee of Union and Progress (CUP), or the Ittihad, was the engine of this revolution. Initially, it was not a purely Turkish nationalist movement. It was a coalition of diverse groups seeking a constitutional monarchy, multiculturalism, and pragmatism over religious oppression. This was the era of the Temporary Alliance, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, ARF, and other minority groups saw in the CUP a chance for survival. They shared a common foe in the Sultan. For a brief moment, the streets of Istanbul and Van saw Turks and Armenians embracing, celebrating a new constitution that promised equality for all subjects, regardless of faith. It was a marriage of convenience born of shared suffering under the monarchy. The dream of a Balkan to Baghdad multicultural democracy was short-lived. Internal failures and the devastating losses in the First Balkan War in 1912 created a vacuum of power and a crisis of confidence. The CUP, once a broad committee, began to radicalize. In January 1913, the Ottoman coup d'état, popularly known as the Raid on the Sublime Porte, permanently altered the empire's DNA. A nationalistic triumvirate, known to history as the Three Pashas, usurped total control within the CUP. Mehmed Talaat Pasha, the administrative mastermind, Minister of the Interior, Ismail Enver Pasha, the military firebrand Minister of War, Ahmed Cemal Pasha, the enforcer, Minister of the Navy. With these three at the helm, the unionist core of the CUP moved from constitutionalism to a nationalistic, constitutional dictatorship. The marriage with Armenian and other minority political groups was violently annulled. The three Pashas changed the direction of the empire by replacing Ottomanism, a shared identity for all, with an extreme, xenophobic worldview. The new core ideology was Pan-Turkism, a desire to unite all Turkic peoples, from the Balkans into Central Asia. This shift was characterized by radical nationalism, the belief that the empire's core was Turkish and Islamic, and that all other identities were potential internal cancers. Xenophobia, a deep-seated suspicion of any group with ties to outside powers, particularly Russia, effectively turning former allies like the Armenians into security risks. Centralization, the dismantling of local autonomies in favor of a rigid, militarized central authority controlled by the CUP. The three Pashas were not merely politicians, they were social engineers. They viewed the empire's recent military humiliations in the Balkans not as a failure of resources, but as a failure of purity. They believed that for the Turkish nation to survive, the Ottoman state had to be Turkified, This was the direction they forced upon the empire: economic nationalization. The attempt to create a national economy by stripping minority groups of their economic dominance and handing those assets to a burgeoning Turkish middle class. Militarization of society. Under Enver Pasha, the military became the primary instrument of social and political change, leading to a culture where security solutions took precedence over legal rights. The influence of the three Pashas turned the Ottoman Empire into a machine designed for the survival of one specific identity, at the expense of all others. By the time the empire entered World War I, the CUP had successfully transformed a diverse, crumbling empire into a radicalized, nationalistic state prepared to take any measure necessary to protect its Pan-Turkic dream. The responsibility of the CUP and the three Pashas for this radical shift is documented in coded telegrams, direct orders from Talaat Pasha that bypass traditional government channels, CUP, Central Committee minutes, revealing the transition from a political party to a state within a state in 1913 Coup records, documenting the literal seizure of power through violence at the Sublime Porte. This article highlights the moment the silk of multicultural promise was replaced by the steel of nationalistic fervor, the precise moment the three Pashas took the wheel and drove the empire toward its final radicalized destination. In a future video, we will discover what this radicalization led to creating one of the most horrific human tragedies. And, as always, this is your host, Donica de Queller, signing off. Subscribe to Silk and Steel for such interesting events that shaped the history as we knew